back to the whole chord progressions thing, like you were talking about. How would you? Let me just pop one of these up, and maybe you need to do it on your end. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe. Yeah. But like this is a kind of a cool little progression. All this is really, it's all in the key of C.
Yeah.
And it ends on the 6 major 7.
Mm.
So it's like. So yeah. So how would you approach that particular chord progression? What would you do? What goes through your mind when you see something like this and it's time for you to take a solo?
There's 2 ways that I kind of approach improv. There's the chord progression that's ingrained in my brain that I know, like all of me. And in the key that I sing it, I know that chord progression, and I see where everything is all over the neck. And I use a lot of my ear to get me around and a lot of other things that I can go into in a minute. But if it's a progression that I'm not familiar with, then if it's one that I can hear, it's a diatonic progression, then I'll step away from, I won't be using anything to help me guide me through it. If it's an easy enough progression, I can hear I've played the similar progression, and I can just kind of go at it and let my ear guide me through the key of C, and I'm aware of what notes in the key of C on the guitar do what, and what notes fit with what chords, and what chords provide tension. I mean, what notes provide tension against certain chords, and I can do all of that diatonically pretty well. If it starts to get away from the diatonic thing, or if the progression is just kind of a little bit hard to remember, I might need to look at the changes. And so when I'm looking at chord changes, how I think of things changes, because now all of a sudden it's a visual thing, and I'm seeing a thing that tells me it's this chord and it's this chord shape, and I can look ahead at the next chord instead of thinking ahead to the next chord while I'm thinking about what I'm playing. So for me, it's actually, I feel like I can do more in some ways when I'm looking at the chord progression, because I can look ahead, and it gives me stability, and my brain won't wander away to something else and forget what key I'm in and stuff like that. And so I would, in this case, I would probably be looking at the chord progression. But there's some things that not looking at the chord progression allow me to do, and it allows me to get more intimate with the instrument, because there's no other thing that my brain is focusing on. So instead, I'll make myself concentrate. Instead of letting a chord sheet do it for me, I'll make my brain try its best to concentrate on what I'm doing, so I can become intimate with the instrument. And I probably will make more personal and deeply meaningful music that way. So those are 2 different ways that I do it. In this case, I would be probably looking at the chords. So if I'm looking at the chords, I see a chord, and I see at the same time, I'm looking at the fingerboard, and I'm visualizing the fingerboard in my head if I'm looking at this. And if I'm looking at this, I'm trying to visualize the page. They're kind of working together. I see the chord arpeggio. Essentially, that's the short answer. I see the arpeggio, and I play notes in the arpeggio and the notes in between the notes in the arpeggio. Rather than thinking of it as a scale, I think of it as the arpeggio, and I see in between those arpeggio notes, there's a 9, there's 11, major 6 if I want it, or minor 6 if I want it, and little chromatic notes, and little, surrounding the notes, enclosure notes. And I just see everything that I can do with the notes that are in that chord. And the arpeggio extends all the way up the neck, and I can play the arpeggio in a lot of different places and connect it. So I'm seeing the chord and playing what's around the chord.
Yeah. Years ago, I asked a guy, and he was a saxophone player. I lived in Fredericksburg, Virginia, before I ever moved into Louisiana, and I was trying to understand soloing and all that. And the guy was talking to me. He was a great jazz saxophone guy. Mm-hmm. He sort of took me under his wing. I said something. I just don't know what to play. When playing, I don't know what to play when it comes time to play my solo. And he said, "Well, it seems to me like your chords, right?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, all the notes are right there under your fingers." Mm-hmm. It's like, that's the notes that you should play, Well, then of course you don't want to just play arpeggios.
Right.
But that gives you an idea of kind of, it's sort of the framework for you.
Exactly. It's like a skeleton.
Yeah. Say, for an example, the D minor 7 or even the A minor 7. I might, I could take I could take those notes, just the A minor right there at the 5th fret, all that. And you can take each note. You can play the note above it, the note below it. Then you can, there are all kinds of ways of stringing that kind of stuff together. And you can, but you've got a framework to build from. So instead of just stringing a bunch of scale notes together, now you do have a framework. So I like that. I love that approach. And that's kind of it's the same thing I do when I'm playing a solo, because yes, the C major scale, all those chords, A minor, D minor, G, C, F, all of those chords are chords that are built from the notes in the C major scale.
Yeah.
But if all you're doing is playing the scale, you're not really following the character of the chord progression.
Right.
Like you said, which notes work.
Yeah.
If you do play a scale, if you do kind of a scale flurry kind of a thing, and you're going from A minor to D minor, maybe you want to hang on a note during the second bar there. You don't want to hang on the wrong note.
Exactly.
Or like when you get to the C major, maybe you want to hang on something at the end of that 4-bar phrase. That's C major 7 at the 4th measure. You sure don't want to hang on an F,
right?
That kind of thing. And if you're playing something this is sort of a jazz thing, you really don't want to end on a C.
Right.
It doesn't have the same effect as adding the major 7 or the 9 or even the 5th works great. So that's the kind of stuff that you have to begin to incorporate into your playing. So like you said, you need to know where you're going.
Right.
If you know where you're headed, then when you get there, you've already thought about how you're going to end the phrase.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I've been tempted to even write out the chord progressions, because I have the lyrics in front of me when I'm singing, and I've been tempted to write out the chord progression so that I could look at it and think ahead. But I haven't done that, and partly because it's not practical, but also I want to get to where these chords, because I know that the guys that developed jazz in the first place, they did what they did because they had the chord progression in their head and under their fingers. They lived with that chord progression. They could hear what was coming up without having to think about it. They knew.
Yeah.
And so, the thing about this chord progression is, in terms of soloing, is that it moves mostly upward by fourth, root movement of a fourth, going through the circle of fourths. For a lot of that. And when you're playing, it doesn't matter whether you're going from the 1 to the 4, or if you're going from the 5 to the 1, or the 2 to the 5, or the 6 up to the 2, or the 3 up to the 6. You're going up a fourth, and there's just a certain way that when you're playing, and you're playing the notes that fit the chord that you're hearing, if the next chord is up a fourth, you just can feel after a few years of doing it where you're going to go next. You're used to the phrasing of going from one chord to a chord that's up a fourth, the sound of going from the E minor 7 to the A minor 7, you know, as I'm playing. I just know that when, you know, I kind of know when I'm hitting the 7th, and I know that that 7 sounds good going down to what's going to be the 3rd and the next chord. And you don't have to think, and that scares people off when you talk sometimes about, you know, I'm going from here, I'm going up to the 7th and then the 3rd of the next chord, but then I go to the next chord that's up a 4th, and they don't follow it. And they're like, if that's how you're supposed to think when you solo, I'm never going to do it. But you really don't think about that when you solo. You think about that when you're practicing, when you're learning, but you have to practice those things and practice them until they become sort of habit in some way. Not necessarily practice them so that you play the same lick over and over again, but practice the idea and the sound of those chords and practice it and hear it so that when you're playing live, you can just focus on playing. And I don't see it as going up to the 3rd. I see it, here's the chord shape, and I know I can add that note. And I see that this is coming next. And so I see that note right there as being a note that I can get to. And, you know, I can grab other notes. And all the little side notes, I'm really just playing that note now. But I just know that these are there too. So I just kind of pull them out and just kind of, you know, as a little aside thing to come and then come back to that note. But that's really the note. And it's visual and it's aural. And people like B.B. King and others do stuff like that, or did. But he's not thinking about theory. In fact, I don't think B.B. King even knows how to play chords. So you have your own way of conceptualizing these things. But they're there. And other people think the same way. They just don't maybe use the same nomenclature, but they think the same way. They know that this fits this chord and that note fits this chord, and that the next chord coming up, especially if you're moving up by fourths, that note will be one of the ones that works in the next chord that's coming up. And you know that from experience and from playing it. So to some degree, root movement of one chord to the next produces a change in the overall harmonic sound that you get used to. Usually if you're going up a second or up a fourth, then you're going from a chord that has these notes in it to a chord that has these notes in it. And there might be a common tone, but a lot of it is not common tones. You're switching from these notes being the more important notes in the key, you know, to these notes. And so it's sort of like you're playing half the team, and now it's time for the other half. Now it's time for the offense to go on to take the field. You know, it's sort of like that. And you get used to that. I mean, your fingers and your ears get used to the way different notes sound as you go up to a familiar chord progression. And so it's like that. And that all comes from, for people that would be listening and thinking, well, how do I incorporate that? That just comes from doing that so much that it becomes ingrained, and you don't really have to think that way about it. And then there are times you do think about it where you're like, I want to do something different. What do I want to do? And there are times when I am thinking things like, you know, I'm going to make the 3rd go up like this, and I'm going to hit the 3rd there, but then on the next chord, I'm going to move this way, and that's going to become a sharp 11, and it's going to clash, but then I'm going to move it down. And, you know, and sometimes I do think about those things. But you know, when I really think the most creative is not when I'm playing solos. Honestly, that's not when I'm the most creative.